Harlem had learned, long before the world bothered to notice, that survival was rarely loud. It arrived softly, in the way men greeted each other on the stoop at dusk, in the way shopkeepers swept their sidewalks even when business was thin, in the way mothers held their children a second longer before letting them step into the street. In those years, the neighborhood lived beneath a constant pressure that never made headlines but shaped every breath laws applied unevenly. Opportunities rationed by skin color, respect treated like a privilege instead of a right. It was in this atmosphere that Bumpy Johnson moved with a calm that unsettled both friends and enemies. He did not rush. He did not posture. He listened, and in a world accustomed to shouting over black voices, that alone made him dangerous. In the most unexpected way, Bumpy's authority did not come from cruelty, nor did it lean on spectacle. It came from memory. He remembered every humiliation Harlem had endured, the bank loans denied without explanation, the police raids staged, more for intimidation than justice, the politicians who visited only when cameras followed and vanished as soon as promises were spoken. He remembered names, faces, and debts that could not be written down. And because he remembered, he carried himself with a dignity that no insult could strip away. When he spoke, men leaned in not because they feared him, but because they trusted. The weight of his silence, long before the events that would fracture alliances and test loyalties. Harlem had already survived one cautionary era, whispered about like a bedtime story meant to warn rather than comfort. Dutch Schultz had once believed the city could be bent entirely by fear. His reign had been loud, erratic, and merciless, leaving scars that lingered long after his name stopped appearing in print. Bumpy watched that chapter unfold with careful distance, learning a lesson that would guide him for decades. Violence burned bright, but it burned out quickly. Restraint, when paired with intelligence, endured. Harlem did not need another tyrant. It needed a steward. By the time the streets began to change again, new money, new ambitions, new faces eager to claim space, Bumpy was already older, already measured, already uninterested in proving what no longer needed proof. He had seen too many men mistake aggression for strength, too many empires collapse under the weight of their own noise. What concerned him now was not control, but balance. Harlem, bruised but proud, needed protection from the kind of power that arrived wearing a smile and left behind a ledger of losses. It was during this fragile equilibrium that Frank Lucas began to rise. Frank was sharp, ambitious, and relentlessly pragmatic, a man who studied the mechanics of power the way others studied scripture. He admired Bumpy openly at first, following him with the attentiveness of a student watching a master at work. There was respect in it, genuine at times, but also calculation. Frank saw opportunity in the spaces Bumpy intentionally left untouched, saw speed where Bumpy valued patience, and in a city that rewarded those who moved fast enough to avoid scrutiny. That difference mattered. Frank's ascent coincided with a familiar pattern Harlem knew too well. Institutions that had long ignored the neighborhood suddenly took interest, not out of care, but out of convenience. Permits became bargaining chips. Inspections arrived unannounced. Minor violations were inflated into threats. The language of bureaucracy did what open hostility could not. It legitimized injustice. Storefronts that had operated for years without issue were suddenly declared non-compliant. Community leaders were summoned and spoken down to, their expertise dismissed by younger men with badges and forms. The message was clear: progress would be allowed, but only on someone else's terms. Bumpy noticed the shift immediately. He heard it in the tone of conversations, felt it in the way people hesitated before speaking freely. The old fear, the one that came from being watched by systems designed to extract rather than serve, was creeping back. What unsettled him most was not the pressure itself, but the way it was being leveraged. He sensed that someone was inviting these forces in, treating them as tools rather than threats. Harlem had survived many enemies, But collaboration with indifference was always the most corrosive. Frank Lucas, eager to secure his position, began to believe that alignment with power outside the neighborhood could accelerate what patience would only delay. He told himself it was strategy, not surrender. He framed it as progress, but the cost was subtle and steep. Each compromise chipped away at the community's dignity, normalizing small humiliations in exchange for temporary advantages. A respected elder was made to wait hours for a meeting that never happened. A business owner was fined into silence. A neighborhood event was denied a permit without explanation. None of it was violent. All of it was devastating. Bumpy did not confront Frank immediately. He watched. He listened. He gathered stories the way a careful man gathered evidence, not to punish, but to understand. He sat in back rooms and on front stoops, absorbing the anger and confusion of people who felt something slipping but couldn't name it. And as he listened, he grew certain of one thing. This was not merely ambition gone too far. It was a betrayal of principle. The injustice lay not in crime or competition, but in the quiet acceptance of disrespect. Racism had always been a blunt instrument, but here it was being wielded with administrative precision. It wore suits and carried clipboards. It smiled while it diminished. Bumpy recognized it instantly because he had lived it his entire life. The danger was not that Harlem would fight back too hard, but that it would learn to endure too much. In public, Bumpy remained composed. He greeted officials politely, thanked clerks for their time, and spoke with the same measured cadence that had always defined him. In private, he prepared not for violence, but for clarity. He believed that injustice, when exposed properly, collapsed under its own contradictions. Systems depended on silence. They relied on people believing they were alone. Bumpy intended to remind Harlem that it was not. As whispers of Frank's maneuvering spread, tension settled over the neighborhood like a low cloud. Some admired his boldness. Others feared the consequences. Bumpy understood both reactions. He remembered being young, hungry, convinced that speed could outrun history. But he also remembered the aftermath, how quickly allies vanished when consequences arrived. He felt no anger toward Frank yet, only disappointment. And disappointment, when left unaddressed, had a way of becoming something heavier. The first real rupture came when a long-standing community space, a place that had hosted meetings, weddings, and quiet acts of solidarity for decades, was threatened. With closure over a technicality no one could adequately explain. The paperwork bore signatures that traced back to offices Frank had recently been frequenting. It was the kind of move that signaled dominance without accountability, a reminder of who could make life difficult with a single stroke of a pen. Bumpy visited this space one evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across familiar walls. He listened as people spoke, their voices tight with frustration and fatigue. When they finished, he said very little. He thanked them for trusting him and promised only that he would look into it. There was no speech, no reassurance. But when he left, something shifted. Hope, fragile but present, followed him out the door. That night, Harlem slept uneasily. Not because of imminent danger, but because change was coming, and change, whether just or cruel, always demanded a price. Bumpy sat alone with his thoughts, weighing the balance he had worked so carefully to maintain. He knew this was the beginning of a larger reckoning. Frank Lucas was not merely testing boundaries, he was redefining them. And if left unchecked, the cost would not be measured in money, but in dignity. As dawn approached, Bumpy made a decision not to confront, not to threaten, but to wait. The most effective responses, he knew, arrived when others believed the moment had passed. Harlem had endured enough to justify action, but not so much that despair had settled in. Timing, as always, would decide everything. This was the first day of a week that would reshape loyalties, expose illusions, and prove once again that the most enduring power was not seized, but earned. And Harlem, watching quietly as it always had, held its breath. The morning after Bumpy Johnson made his decision to wait, Harlem woke with the uneasy feeling that comes before weather changes, when the air feels heavier, when birds quiet themselves. Without instruction. It was not fear exactly, but anticipation, the kind that settles into a place that has learned, through long experience, to read signs others ignore. Men lingered longer at corner newsstands. Shopkeepers paused mid-sweep, watching the street as if it might answer a question they hadn't yet asked. And above it all moved Bumpy Johnson, calm as ever, his stillness now carrying the gravity of something gathering its strength. Frank Lucas did not notice the shift at first. He was riding momentum, intoxicated by the efficiency of systems finally bending in his favor. Meetings that once required patience were now handled with a call. Obstacles dissolved when the right names were mentioned. To Frank, this was proof not of compromise, but of evolution. He told himself that Harlem needed a man who understood the modern game, a man unafraid to use the tools available. What he refused to acknowledge was the cost paid by people who never sat at those tables, who felt the consequences without sharing the benefits. The second insult came quietly, wrapped in procedure. A local grocer, known for extending credit during hard weeks, found his supply deliveries stalled without explanation. No accusation was made, no charge filed. Just delays, paperwork, silence. It was the kind of pressure that crushed slowly, invisibly, forcing a man to choose between pride and survival. When word reached Bumpy, he did not react. He visited the grocer instead, listened to the details, and left without promise. But that evening, he wrote the man's name in a small notebook he kept not for numbers, but for memories that demanded accountability. By midweek, the pattern had become unmistakable. A permit denied here, an inspection there, always justified, always polite, always targeting those least equipped to fight back. Harlem had seen this before, in different forms, under different administrations, but the familiarity did not dull the sting. What made it worse was the knowledge unspoken, but widely felt, that this pressure had an inside track. Someone had opened the door and stepped aside. Someone had decided that leverage mattered more than loyalty. Frank Lucas sensed resistance, only as a faint echo. He heard whispers of Bumpy's displeasure and dismissed them as nostalgia clinging to relevance. He respected Bumpy, or believed he did, but respect did not outweigh ambition. In Frank's mind, power was about inevitability. He believed he had become inevitable. That belief made him careless. The third injustice landed like a public humiliation. A community organizer, a woman whose work had kept young men in school and out of trouble for years, was summoned to a municipal office and spoken to as if she were a nuisance rather than an asset. Her funding was frozen pending a review no one could define. She left the building in tears, dignity bruised, resolve shaken. When Bumpy heard what had happened, witnesses noticed something rare, a tightening around his eyes, a pause that lasted a beat longer than usual. This was no longer coincidence. It was choreography. Bumpy understood then that waiting could not become inaction. The weak had to be allowed to ripen, but not rot. He began to move not visibly, not urgently, but decisively. He spoke to men who understood paperwork better than posturing, to lawyers who knew how regulations could be turned back on themselves, to clerks who remembered favors owed not in money, but in respect. He asked questions that forced people to look twice at what they had signed. He reminded them gently of laws written to protect rather than punish. At the same time, he did something Frank did not anticipate. He remained publicly courteous to him. They crossed paths at a function late in the week, exchanged pleasantries, shared a moment of practiced civility. Frank mistook this for acceptance. He did not see the way others watched the exchange, did not feel the tension tightening, like a wire drawn too far. Harlem noticed. Harlem always did, Behind the scenes, the cost of Frank's strategy began to surface. Officials who had enjoyed the convenience of his cooperation grew uneasy as questions multiplied. Files were reopened, timelines examined. The kind of scrutiny that made bureaucrats nervous settled in. No accusations were leveled, no threats made. Just inquiries, polite, persistent, impossible to ignore. The machinery Frank relied on slowed, then hesitated. The turning point approached without ceremony. On the 7th day since the first space had been threatened, Bumpy Johnson made a single phone call. It was not to Frank. It was to a man whose signature appeared too often on documents that harmed the neighborhood. Bumpy did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He described, calmly and precisely, the sequence of actions taken, the communities affected, the laws implicated. He spoke as a citizen, as an elder, as a man who understood that silence could be interpreted as consent, and who refused to grant it. When he finished, he thanked the man for his time and hung up. The effect was immediate, though not loud. Within hours, emails were sent, meetings scheduled, reviews initiated. By the next morning, permits were reconsidered, inspections postponed, funding unfrozen pending clarification. The pressure that had been applied so carefully began to reverse direction, seeking the path of least resistance away from exposure. Frank Lucas felt the shift like a sudden loss of balance. Calls went unanswered. Promises became vague. The very systems he had trusted to elevate him now distanced themselves with practiced neutrality. It dawned on him, slowly and painfully, that the advantage he believed permanent had been conditional all along. He had mistaken access for allegiance. When Frank finally confronted Bumpy, the meeting was quiet. There were no raised voices, no threats. Bumpy listened as Frank spoke of strategy, of necessity, of a world that rewarded those willing to move faster than sentiment allowed. When Frank finished, Bumpy responded with only a few words, delivered without judgment. He spoke of dignity as a currency that never depreciated, of power that protected rather than extracted, of respect earned once and lost quickly. He did not condemn Frank. He simply made the cost visible. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Frank understood then that what he had lost was not territory or profit, but standing. The neighborhood did not cheer. There was no celebration. There was only relief and a quiet restoration of balance. By the end of the week, Harlem breathed easier. Not because it believed injustice had been defeated forever, but because it had been answered with intelligence rather than force. Bumpy Johnson returned to his routines, his authority reaffirmed not by spectacle, but by outcome. And Frank Lucas, left to reckon with the difference between speed and wisdom, faced a truth he could no longer ignore. Some empires collapse not when attacked, but when they forget who they were built to serve. The reckoning was not over. It had only begun. By the time the consequences of that quiet phone call began to ripple outward, Harlem understood something fundamental had shifted. The neighborhood did not celebrate, because celebration would have cheapened what had been preserved. Instead, it listened. It listened to the way officials suddenly chose their words more carefully, to the way documents once stamped without thought were now read twice, to the way men who had grown accustomed to treating Harlem as a corridor, rather than a home, began to lower their voices when they walked its streets. At the center of this change stood Bumpy Johnson, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, his power now amplified by restraint rather than force. Frank Lucas felt the reversal more sharply than anyone. The speed that had once been his advantage became a liability, his momentum replaced by friction he could neither name nor fight directly. Meetings ended early. Invitations stopped arriving. Men who once answered on the first ring let the phone hum until it went quiet. Frank told himself it was temporary, a correction that would soon settle. But doubt has a way of finding space in silence, and each unanswered call widened it. For the first time, he wondered whether he had mistaken Bumpy's patience for permission. Whether the calm he had dismissed as old-fashioned was, in fact, a deeper understanding of how power survived scrutiny. The city, sensing vulnerability, leaned in, not with overt hostility, but with questions that demanded answers. Audits were announced, reviews scheduled, files pulled from cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. None of it accused Frank directly, but all of it narrowed the space he had relied on. Systems that once moved for him now moved around him, insulating themselves from association. He watched alliances thin, then disappear, the way fog lifts do. Reveal how exposed a man truly is. Harlem's elders noticed the change first. They saw it in the way young men were treated with renewed caution rather than casual suspicion, in the way community meetings resumed without the looming threat of interference. The pressure had not vanished, but it had retreated, reassessing its approach. People spoke Bumpy's name less frequently now, not out of fear, but out of understanding. He had done what he always did, protected the neighborhood without asking it to kneel in gratitude. Yet the story did not move toward resolution so easily. Frank Lucas, proud and cornered, searched for a way to reassert control. He believed that exposure could be met with escalation, that silence could be broken by a show of confidence. He began to push back, leaning on what leverage remained, attempting to remind the city that he was still a force to be reckoned with. It was a mistake born of desperation. Each move he made drew more attention, not less, and attention was now the last thing he could afford. Bumpy watched all of this unfold with the patience of a man who understood timing better than tactics. He knew that power, when threatened, often revealed itself through excess. He also knew that the line between correction and humiliation was thin, and that crossing it would undo everything he had protected. His goal was not to destroy Frank, but to stop him from destroying what Harlem had built with care and sacrifice. Justice, in Bumpy's mind, was not about punishment. It was about restoration. The night the tension reached its peak, the city seemed to pause. A storm gathered without breaking, clouds heavy but disciplined, as if even the sky were waiting for permission. Frank requested a meeting, insisting this time, his confidence sharpened by urgency. Bumpy agreed, not because he felt compelled, but because the moment had arrived. The meeting place was modest, chosen deliberately, stripped of symbolism, no audience, no theater. Just two men and the weight of their choices. Frank arrived first, pacing, rehearsing arguments he believed would reclaim ground. When Bumpy entered, the room settled. There was no confrontation in his demeanor, no accusation in his eyes. He sat, removed his hat, and waited. Frank spoke at length, of pressure, of survival, of a city that rewarded boldness and punished hesitation. He framed his actions as necessary adaptations, compromises made in a world that offered few clean paths. As he spoke, his voice rose and fell, betraying the strain beneath his certainty. When Frank finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It pressed against him, forcing him to sit with what he had said. Bumpy did not rush to fill it. He understood that silence, properly placed, could do more than any argument. When he finally spoke, his words were few and measured. He did not challenge Frank's intelligence or ambition. He spoke instead of responsibility, of the difference between moving ahead and leaving others behind, of the cost communities pay when their dignity becomes negotiable. He reminded Frank that power borrowed from indifference always demanded repayment, and that repayment was rarely collected from those who benefited most. There was no condemnation in his tone, only clarity. Bumpy named the harm, not to shame Frank, but to make it impossible to ignore. He spoke of elders humiliated, of businesses threatened into silence, of young people learning that progress required submission. He ended not with a warning, but with an offer. Step back, correct the course, allow the neighborhood to regain its footing without further interference. The decision, he said quietly, would define not just Frank's legacy, but his own understanding. Of what power was meant to do that, Frank felt the truth land with a force no threat could have carried. He realized in that moment that the city had already chosen which version of power it trusted. He could escalate and be isolated further, or he could retreat and preserve what remained of his standing. The choice was not easy, and it was not clean, but it was unavoidable. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain washing the streets with a steady, unhurried rhythm. By morning, changes were visible. Interference eased. Reviews concluded without spectacle. The machinery that had pressed down so carefully disengaged, retreating into bureaucratic neutrality. Harlem noticed, not with cheers, but with a quiet exhale. The city had held its breath, and now it released it slowly. Bumpy returned to his routines as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. He walked the streets, greeted neighbors, listened more than he spoke. His power, reaffirmed by outcome, rather than display, settled back into its rightful place. Frank Lucas, chastened and quieter, began the long work of reckoning, not with the city, but with himself. The story, however, was not finished. Resolution had been deferred, not delivered. Redemption, if it was to come, would require more than retreat. It would require understanding. And understanding, Bumpy knew, was the rarest form of power the city ever produced. The morning after the rain, Harlem woke into a different kind of quiet. Not the uneasy stillness that followed threats or the brittle calm that preceded raids, but a steadier silence, the kind that settles after something heavy has been lifted. People felt it before they named it. Doors opened a little earlier. Conversations stretched a little longer. The city did not declare victory, because Harlem had learned that dignity did not require applause. It required space to breathe. And for the first time in weeks, that space had been returned. At the center of it all was Bumpy Johnson, moving through the neighborhood with the same unhurried grace he had always carried. There was no change in his stride, no public acknowledgement of what he had done, because to acknowledge it would have shifted the focus away from where it belonged. Bumpy did not believe in men being bigger than their communities. He believed in men being useful to them. Power to him was never meant to be admired. It was meant to disappear once its work was done. The systems that had pressed down on Harlem withdrew not with apology, but with compliance. Permits were restored, reviews quietly closed. Funding resumed under the language of clerical oversight. It was imperfect, unsatisfying in the way all bureaucratic corrections were, but it was enough. The humiliation had been reversed, if not erased, and in neighborhoods that survived by memory, reversal mattered. Elders who had been dismissed were consulted again. Organizers who had been sidelined returned to work with steadier footing. Children watched adults stand straighter and learned without anyone needing to explain that patience could be powerful when paired with resolve. For Frank Lucas, the silence was heavier. He felt the absence of influence like a missing limb. Where there had once been immediate access, there was now polite distance. Where confidence had flowed easily, doubt had taken root. He walked the same streets but felt exposed on them, not because anyone threatened him, but because no one needed to. Frank had discovered the cost of confusing leverage with leadership, and the lesson did not arrive with drama. It arrived slowly in the way doors closed without slamming. He did not seek Bumpy out again. Pride held him back at first, and then something closer to humility. Frank began to understand that the power he had chased required constant maintenance. Compromise, while the power Bumpy wielded seemed to regenerate on its own. It grew quieter as it grew stronger, until it no longer needed to announce itself at all. This realization did not redeem Frank, but it did fracture the certainty that had guided him. And fractured certainty, painful as it was, made room for reflection. The true resolution did not come through a final confrontation or a dramatic reversal. It came through a moment so small most people missed it. At a community meeting weeks later, One Frank had not been invited to, but chose to attend anyway. A young man stood to speak about opportunity, about the kind of future Harlem deserved. He spoke without anger, without bravado. When he finished, the room waited. Bumpy nodded once, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, but the young man's shoulders relaxed as if he had been given permission simply to exist. Frank saw that nod, and in it, he saw the difference between being feared and being trusted. Bumpy Johnson never claimed credit. He never told the story as a story. When asked, he deflected, speaking instead about the neighborhood's resilience, about people who refused to surrender their dignity, even when pressured to do so politely. He believed that naming injustice mattered less than correcting it, and that correction, done right, should feel almost invisible. The absence of harm was its own reward. Harlem carried the lesson forward quietly. It did not become immune to injustice, but it became more alert to its subtler forms. People learned to recognize when power arrived wearing professionalism, when cruelty hid behind policy. And they learned that response did not always require confrontation. Sometimes it required memory. Sometimes it required timing. Sometimes it required a single conversation, delivered calmly, to the right person, at the right moment. As seasons changed, the city moved on, as cities always do. New conflicts emerged. New ambitions tested old boundaries. But the story of that week lingered, passed not as rumor, but as understanding. It reminded people that strength did not need to be loud to be effective, that justice could arrive without spectacle, and that dignity, once defended, had a way of defending itself. Bumpy Johnson grew older, but his presence never diminished. He continued to listen more than he spoke, to intervene only when necessary, to trust that communities, when respected, could regulate themselves better than any outside force. His legacy was not an empire, but an ethical way of moving through the world that left fewer scars than it found. Frank Lucas continued his path, altered but not absolved, carrying with him the knowledge that some victories were hollow, and some losses instructive. He learned, too late to undo what had been done, but not too late to understand it. That power taken without regard for dignity always returned with a bill. In the end, there was no dramatic closing scene, no final declaration. There was only Harlem, standing where it had always stood, battered but unbroken, its people still sweeping sidewalks, still greeting one another at dusk, still holding their children a second longer before letting go. And somewhere in that ordinary rhythm lived the quiet truth Bumpy Johnson had spent a lifetime proving, that the most powerful acts are often the ones that leave nothing broken behind.